In recent months, I've read and reread hundreds of Superman comics from various eras, aiming to understand the character's true essence. Yeah, that's something very difficult to do because over the years, Superman has symbolized different things. We've seen him as a social fighter, American propaganda tool, symbol of hope, agent of change, biblical reference, and even immigrant story. The situation gets more complicated because we all have an idea in our heads of what Superman should be, and we all think we're right about it. Even though in the comics he's taken on hundreds of forms. However, I have a theory that there's a major unifying element, a certain characteristic or characteristics that truly make Superman who he is. The challenge is figuring that out, which is what today's video covers. Plus, I've read hundreds of Superman comics. I chose the most representative stories from each era, organized the information coherently, linked similar stories, and separated anomalies to analyze the character over time, so that by the end of this video, we could truly understand the greatest superhero of all. This video is the result of several months of work. It's the longest video essay in the history of the channel, so from the bottom of my heart, I hope you enjoy it. My name is Global Monitor, and here today we're going to take Superman very seriously. Gol. The Monitor. Throughout this video, I'll discuss many Superman comics. When Superman debuted in 1938, the world had never seen anything like him. The superhero concept barely existed then. So for the kids of that time, seeing such a colorful character lifting a car must have been impressive. In fact, that's how it was. Since his first appearance, he became a massive sales success. You can't imagine how different Superman was when he first appeared. His iconic S and costume were different, and he couldn't fly, shoot eye rays, or use super breath. These powers emerged over time, but the biggest change was in his own story. In his early comics, Superman battled realistic evil instead of supervillains. Corrupt politicians, coups, wives, and greedy businessmen. So in his early stories, Superman fought for social justice. A people's hero who often broke the law in pursuit of justice. Some businessmen made their miners work in terrible conditions. Superman would kidnap them and make them work. If an arms manufacturer profited from war, Superman would force him to join the army. Superman often gave moral lessons, having perpetrators see things from the victim's perspective. As the character gained popularity, Detective Comics gave him a more familiar moral code. Would that better reflect the patriotism felt in those years, as the United States began entering World War II? This was when the character changed dramatically, because he moved away from the roots he was born with and became a vehicle of nationalist propaganda that represented American power. This was when the character was first linked to truth, justice, and the American way of life. A stigma that would follow the character for the next 80 years of existence? In his book Super Gods, Grant Morrison talks about this moment in history. He says Superman's success was due to this iconic cover which elevated humanity and was a humanist response to soulless industrialism. Because Superman, though Kryptonian, was still a man, showing that people mattered in an increasingly automated world, which makes the character very similar to stories from American folklore, like John Henry, the hero who beat a steam machine by driving spikes into a railroad track. A nod later seen in Superman myths through John Henry, also known as Steel. He also mentions the importance of Clark Kent and Superman's duality. While heroes like Hercules or Perseus were always heroic, Superman showed a unique duality through Clark Kent, the affable reporter who was initially despised by Lois Lane and who made many readers identify with him. We've all felt awkward or misunderstood, yet we dream of having great potential. A Superman-like angelic figure who represents our ideal self. So Superman quickly became a national phenomenon, which soon had other adaptations, like the legendary animated shorts from the Fleischer Studio, which still look beautiful even by today's standards, and above all, the Superman radio show. Expanded the character's mythology by introducing kryptonite, flight, and characters like Perry White. In fact, this is one of my favorite moments in Superman's history. He defeated a well-known, intolerant bully in real life. Let me explain how it happened. During World War II, Superman's radio show was at the height of its popularity and often featured stories against German supervillains. But when the war ended, they decided to go in a different direction. At the same time, a doctor named Samuel Green, who was the Grand Dragon of the Klan, wanted his organization to become popular again, so he organized a photo shoot that was published in Life magazine. Turns out the Klan wasn't always such an underground group. They once had popular support and even held family picnics. Despite their violent aims, Samuel wanted to restore the clan's former glory until the organization's popularity and credibility declined. But he didn't expect the Superman radio show to air a 16-part story called The Clan of the Fiery Cross, where listeners from all over the country heard how Superman protected a Chinese immigrant family from a group of violent fanatics. In the show, Superman literally called the clan intolerant fanatics and said that intolerance was a disgusting weed. The show had some detractors who threatened to boycott the program, but it was also reported that most people accepted it. Newsweek called it the first children's show to promote social awareness. Being depicted as brutish, clumsy, and hateful on a children's show meant the clan lost the respect it once had. This occurred in 1946, but you can read an adaptation in the comic Superman Fights the Clan, narrated by Chinese immigrant author Jin Luen Yang. How did this story help his family, and how does Superman represent tolerance and respect? Since World War II, unfortunately, something happened and Superman's story had to change during the 50s. It turns out that a psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, where he linked superheroes and comics in general to criminal and violent tendencies. As a psychiatrist, people listened to him, leading to mass comic book burnings. The industry chose to self-regulate, establishing a code of conduct known as the Comics Code. It essentially claimed superheroes were violent and featured lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender themes, corrupt politicians or criminals who were too likable. So, Superman entered the Silver Age of comics, shifting his stories towards science fiction. They took a more childish and even comical approach than in previous eras. Some might dismiss this comic era as childish, but these stories have a unique charm. Not only because it presents extremely creative stories that force you to expand your imagination through fantastic concepts, but also because it was the era in which Lord of expanded to levels we had never seen before. On one hand, Lex Luthor was finally seen as a real threat, since for the first time he pushed the Man of Steel to his limits. In the golden age of comics, this didn't happen because Superman was always far more powerful than any challenge he faced. In the Silver Age, Lex devised multiple plans to strip the Man of Steel of his powers. He nearly defeated him several times, but Superman ultimately outsmarted and beat him with cleverness, not strength. That's a key trait of this Superman, who relied more on cunning than violence or strength. Superman's first encounter with Brainiac is another example, who strips the Man of Steel's powers by sending him to Kandor's miniature city, and he has to find a way, without powers, to escape and rescue the Kryptonian city. It was a time of more villains and more heroes. During this time, Supergirl debuted and became a regular character with her own stories. In the second half of the Action Comics issues, Krypto, the mischievous dog with powers who caused Clark a lot of trouble. Jonathan and Martha Kent became key characters in Superboy, focusing on Clark's teen years. With his romance with Lana Lang and characters like Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane, they got their own comics where they had their own adventures, both focused on science fiction and fantasy. Lois mainly tried to uncover Superman's secret identity and marry him. Remy Geiger, is Lois there? Meanwhile, Superman was shown as a character in a world with many other heroes, such as the Justice League, and of course Batman, with whom he shared the comic world's finest. Remember, comics then targeted kids but were written by adult men with a specific vision of heroes. However, these kids who read comics grew up, and some of them started working in the industry. They brought comics a new strength and vitality never seen before. And this was when comics started to become more thoughtful and began to question what was previously considered unquestionable. Action Comics 368 is an example I see as the link between Superman's Silver and Bronze Ages. It's a strange story that makes us wonder, did Superman really make this mistake? One day, Superman comes back from space and sees that crime on Earth has stopped. The criminals now have honest jobs. The supervillains are turning themselves in, and even natural disasters have stopped happening. All this makes Superman feel useless, as his life lacks purpose. Not even as Clark Kent, who has no interesting news to report. The reason for the change is some beings called Sentinels, who claim to be helping the world. But they also think that Superman is so powerful that he's a danger, so they ask him to leave Earth and never return. Superman does it but grows suspicious and returns to Earth just in time to see. How is it that one of the Sentinels is about to destroy his Fortress of Solitude with the city of Kandor inside? Superman defeats it and goes to destroy the others. But before being destroyed, the last Sentinel reveals something impressive. The Sentinels truly wanted to help the world and were about to return to their normal size in Kandor. Superman sees evil return and realizes he must keep being a hero, since all the world's evil stems from his own mistakes. This 1968 comic is one of the first times a writer dares, in some way, to question Superman, because it describes a character who needs a world with evil to survive. Because if evil didn't exist, the figure of the superhero would be irrelevant. In 1972, 4 years later, there must be a Superman used a similar approach. Here, the Guardians of Oa introduced the idea to the Man of Steel that maybe he's helping humanity too much. By protecting us, he's actually doing more harm than good because he's preventing our cultural growth. After the conversation, Superman protects exploited Mexican immigrants, but he also tells them that his help has its limits. They'll need willpower to solve their problems. The comic ends with Superman debating how much to help, while the Guardians conclude their work is finished. Why? Because their goal wasn't to stop Superman, but to make him question whether he should do everything he can. It should be noted that these stories were written during the Vietnam War, a period when young people were increasingly questioning the role that the government and authority figures in general should play in society. So it makes sense that figures in power like Superman were also questioned and even linked to a very specific political ideology, just as we saw in the 1985 comic The Dark Knight Returns, where Superman is portrayed as a government agent who puts laws and authority figures like the president above what he believes is right, which is why he is forced to fight against Batman. In this era, not only were his actions under scrutiny, but also his motivations. This is well shown in Superman Annual number 11, For the Man Who Has Everything. Alan Moore's story where Mongol traps Superman in a mental illusion, letting him live his deepest desire. Here we see Kal longing for a simple life on Krypton as a geologist and family man. However, little by little the illusion breaks and Kal has to say goodbye to a son who never existed. This wasn't the only story that Alan Moore would write for Superman. In fact, the future had one of the most significant moments for the character in store for him. In the mid-1980s, after almost 50 years of stories, Detective Comics decided it was time to reboot its continuity to make it simpler for new readers. They launched Crisis on Infinite Earths, where heroes and villains from the multiverse unite against ultimate evil. The Anti-Monitor, in a story ending 50 years of continuity. Before moving to the next chapter, Detective Comics had to give Superman closure. When we think of Alan Moore, we picture dark tales, warring gods, and cunning villains. But in 1986, he wrote a very optimistic Superman story, even though at first it doesn't seem like it, because he kills off many central characters. It's about the comic Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, which was designed to give an ending to the Superman stories that had been written since 1938. This was challenging, as Moore had to conclude each character's story while also matching the old comic's writing style. From the cover, we were told that big things were coming in this comic. Bizarro Massacre, Clark Kent's death, new team, Luthor Brainiac, Daily Planet's final battle. All these situations are wrapped in a great mystery, because apparently there's someone behind it all, controlling everything. The comic doesn't just work as a tribute to concepts and characters from the Silver Age like Krypto, Lana Lang, or Jimmy Olsen. But it's one of those rare occasions where a superhero gets a definitive ending. We glimpse a future where Superman hasn't been seen in years, prompting us to wonder what happened to the Man of Tomorrow. On second thought, it's not that optimistic, just optimistic for Alan Moore. It wasn't enough to wrap up Superman stories. Detective Comics was more focused on the character's future. Writer and artist John Byrne launched the new Man of Steel continuity with his Man of Steel saga, which many fans consider one of the character's best runs. Byrne retells Superman's origin, from Krypton's explosion to his arrival in Metropolis and first meeting with Lex Luthor. While telling a classic story, he also reimagines and modernizes the character, laying much of the groundwork that many stories would use over the next 30 years. If you want a chronological infographic of all the comics I've mentioned in this video so you know which to read, you can go to my Instagram, follow me, send me a message, and I'll gladly send it to you completely free. Let's continue. Since the Man of Steel arc presents changes from the very beginning, it all starts with how Jor-El and Lara send Kal-El to Earth. Since in just a few panels we're told that Kryptonian civilization was in decline and that in recent years it had become a cold society without compassion or even love. A message much like the one from the first scene of Man of Steel. Since both stories show you that Kal is different from the rest of the Kryptonians, in a way, he is someone who represents the best virtues of what Krypton once was. But that's not all the changes. Jonathan and Martha Kent, who usually only appeared in the Superboy stories because they die before Clark becomes an adult, are introduced as important supporting characters for the story. We watch them raise their son with human family values, supporting him as he grows into Superman. Lois Lane is now a fearless journalist focused on her work and uncovering the truth rather than dating Superman. Lex Luthor is now a white-collar criminal and multinational company owner, rather than just an evil scientist as before. These changes are now classics seen in many adaptations, but Byrne started them. He also introduced us to a more human Clark Kent. He makes mistakes and can be selfish, but he learns and works to improve. Something more similar to the Clark we see in other adaptations like Smallville. That reboot was great, and from here the only way was forward. This new continuity took the character to places the old canon never fully explored. A great example of this was when Lois and Clark finally decided, after decades of having a complicated relationship in the comics, to get engaged. That was set to be the comic season's main event, Superman and Lois Lane's wedding. But fate, or rather the Detective Comics brand, had other plans. At that time, Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman was about to premiere, so the network thought it was a good idea. To align the comics wedding with the series, the issue was it would take a long time to occur in the show. The writers had to create a new story arc to delay the wedding in the comics. This was when, in a meeting, the writer Jerry Ordway jokingly said, "Let's kill him." And just like he used to do every time they ran out of ideas, but this time, no one laughed. In fact, they decided to take his suggestion very seriously. That's how the idea for Superman's death began, with a new villain, Doomsday, battling the Man of Steel to the death, leading to Superman's fall. Defending Metropolis, the city he swore to protect, the comic was an impressive sales success. It wasn't just a big event for comic fans, but national and international media also covered the news. Thousands who'd never read comics before rushed to stores for a copy. Another reason this comic stood out was that it reminded people Superman remains an important cultural icon. Even though, in an era of anti-heroes and darker characters, many already saw him as an outdated Boy Scout. The next arc is titled Funeral for a Friend. It would reveal the impact of Superman's death on the whole Detective Comics universe, especially on those closest to him as a person, not just as Superman. Superman comics stopped being published for several months during a major event. Later, they returned. We would see the rebirth of the Man of Steel through arcs like The Reign of the Superman. Finally, Superman marries Lois Lane after returning from death. Something I love about this edition is that the paper is like wedding invitation paper. Just check this out. This last page, and several artists from the characters' past were invited to collaborate in this event. For these dates, by then, Superman had over 50 years of history, and events like his death proved he was much more than just a comic book character. He was a global cultural icon. For better or worse, everyone knew the story of two desperate scientists sending their last hope into the sky. And they sent their son down the river. From Fate all the way to Kansas, where he was raised by a kind couple and eventually becomes Superman. What do you do when your character is already well known? The answer is to shake things up. Although many stories from the 40s and 50s took place outside the main continuity, that is outside of Detective Comics canon. In 1989, the company started releasing its famous characters' stories under the Elseworlds imprint, self-contained stories where alternate realities of these characters were explored. The writers loved this concept because it let them deeply explore and change these characters without impacting the main continuity. In Generations, we examined what would happen if Superman and Batman aged in real time, in the dark side. What would have happened if Kal-El's rocket had landed on Apokolips? Meanwhile, in The Nail, a world is explored where Kal-El was raised by Orthodox Jews, so he never became Superman. And what about the Justice League? It forms in a world that is increasingly distrustful of metahumans. The Elseworlds label has many great publications, but 3 alternate stories stand out to me for their cultural impact. The first of these was Kingdom Come from 1996, a comic beautifully painted by Alex Ross. It tells us about how the generation of heroes from the past, led by Superman, retires and gives way to a new generation of heroes. In this comic, the Man of Steel is more impatient, impulsive, and violent. A global tragedy compels him to return from exile to fix a world that's become more complex, where good and evil are harder to distinguish. This is a great story because it tells us about a Superman who, in terms of powers, is much stronger but who has lost his moral compass. He's unsure if his cause is just or how to do what's right. An interesting aspect of this Superman story is that his greatest power isn't strength or flight, but doing what's right. Another acclaimed and influential story is Superman, Red Son, where Kal-El's rocket lands in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So Kal grows up to become Stalin's successor and a champion of the communist cause. Here we see him blinded by his need to protect the world, so Kal. Gradually, he limits people's freedoms and commits more questionable acts, under the pretext of protecting us. A story that was also highly acclaimed because it makes us wonder if Superman, under certain circumstances, would be capable of hurting us, thinking he's doing it for our own good. In those alternate stories, we have to mention Injustice, which is easily the most controversial Superman comic. A story in which the Man of Steel is tricked by Joker and commits a terrible crime against Lois Lane, who was pregnant, which leads Superman to end Joker's life. And he becomes a global dictator determined to achieve peace at any cost, even at the expense of our free will. It's a very popular story because it's easy to read and features devastating tragic moments. Additionally, a popular video game drew many new readers. However, it portrays Superman and other heroes very differently from their classic versions. Many say this story betrays the characters, as Superman prioritizes control over hope and inspiration and crosses lines the real Superman wouldn't, which can make some people have a wrong idea of what Superman usually is. What do you think about this game? This is a great example of an important point. Detective Comics decides which stories it approves or rejects. Over the years, many canonical representations of Superman have existed in different eras. But even though Detective Comics owns the canon, the character is already beyond their control. Because it's us who decide, through the stories we read and share, which versions of the character are more valid and which are less valid. Because only those stories that connected with us the most are the ones that endure. But what's interesting is that these decisions don't just tell us about the character, but about us as a society. So we should ask ourselves, why is an evil version of Superman so popular, to the point that it's become a common theme in many adaptations of the character? It's also worth noting that some reinterpretations keep the character in familiar settings. James Gunn recently said retelling Superman's origin story was pointless. There was a time when that comic repeatedly ended and restarted the character's origins. Interestingly, all these comics essentially told the same story of Clark Kent becoming Superman. The details gave us a completely different experience, for all seasons told how a shy Kansas boy faced the big city. Birthright shows how Clark balanced his human upbringing with his Kryptonian heritage. Secret Origin is a tribute to the classic Silver Age Superboy story. In Action Comics, during the New 52 reboot, Grant Morrison returned the character to his roots as a champion of the underprivileged, lowering his powers and altering his costume, but giving us a hopeful Superman who can do the impossible. While stories like Earth 1 and American Alien focused on asking themselves, what's fascinating about the character is that changing a few things creates entirely different versions. Because by this point, Superman isn't a rigid formula, but a character with mythological qualities who can be seen and interpreted from different angles, which allows us to see different facets of Clark Kent which adapt to different eras. And it tells us what the most important values of society are at that exact moment in history. This feeling appeared in other Superman comics too. Suddenly, a crying woman strikes him. Why? She couldn't reach him in time so he could save her husband's life, who urgently needed a microscopic operation. Only Superman could do this, even though he didn't know this person existed. It made us face a situation we usually avoid and comics often ignore. How many lives does Superman not save with each decision? I know it's a tough question, but realistically, whenever Superman saves a burning building, he has to ignore another disaster. By ending a war, he's causing other negative outcomes. Every time he takes a break, thousands who could be saved aren't. In this grounded comic, Superman decides to walk across the United States to reconnect with what truly matters to people. When do we encounter these comics? Movies like Man of Steel make sense, as they were made amid stories like Earth 1 or American Alien, which featured darker elements. Maybe because we lived in a time when it was hard for us to believe that power could be as innocent as Superman. Sometimes they made it seem that way and focused on showing us the flaws of these characters, who at first glance seemed perfect. Not all approaches are grim. The comic Peace on Earth for Earth, for example, addresses the topic realistically but ends more optimistically. Here, the Man of Steel attempts an unprecedented feat, delivering food to the whole world. But he realizes the world is more complex than he thought, and that there are some tasks that are too big for one man, even if he's a Superman. However, in the end he decides to lead by example, just as he always has. But Superman's political ideals also changed with the new century. And a story that I love for what it represents is Action Comics 900, in which Superman renounces his American citizenship and sides with some protesters who oppose a repressive government. After over 50 years, Superman stopped fighting for only one country and became a global hero, who now fought for truth, justice, a better tomorrow. The best thing for Superman in the 21st century is Grant Morrison writing him, All Stars. For many, Superman is the definitive story of the character, since it captures the essence of what Superman is and has been throughout his entire history. In this story, Superman is poisoned by Lex Luthor with a solar energy overload, and with little time left must prepare himself, his family and friends, and the world, for a world in which he will no longer be. This comic blends elements from different Superman eras, presenting them with a timeless perspective. It clearly shows why Superman acts as he does and stays relevant decades after his creation. Many Superman stories reduce his powers to make him more human. What's interesting about this story and Grant Morrison's approach is that he always makes Superman as strong as the story needs. And thanks to that, in his stories, we've seen him be wise enough to answer the unanswerable question, strong enough to carry infinity, and so intelligent that he can memorize and understand the miracle machine from the distant future in just a few seconds. So powerful he could stop an interplanetary war just by wishing for a happy ending. And even his cosmic armor version, Superman was able to hear the rustling of the reader's pages as they turned them and had the ability to alter the plot. For Morrison, who grew up terrified of nuclear holocaust during the Cold War, Superman was an idea much more powerful than the atomic bomb itself. So he dedicated his life to making it as real as possible. Grant Morrison proved the Man of Steel still had many stories to tell while preserving his classic traits. That may be why Detective Comics keeps reinventing the character to make him more accessible to new audiences, through reboots such as the New 52 and Rebirth, and many others that honestly haven't had the same impact but still let the character evolve. Since nowadays it's more common to see him married to Lois Lane and even with a son, John Kent, who initially had many adventures with his father. Later, he even assumed Superman's role during his absence. And yes, John saw the world differently as Superman, since his stories and battles focused more on ecological issues and fighting systemic injustices. These are struggles that Clark might not feel as comfortable with because he wasn't born in our world, but John adopts them as his own. Recent stories like Space Age, a very dark tale, show that Superman still represents hope even in death. The Warworld saga tells us about how Superman tries to free a civilization from its ideological chains. Absolute Superman offers a new origin for the Man of Steel, making him a social fighter for the oppressed again. Anthologies like The World show the Man of Steel through the eyes of different creative teams worldwide. So at the end of the day, who is Superman? While he seems to be an enigma portrayed over almost 90 years, each of his stories gives us a small piece of the answer. Yes, it's a flaw. Champion of the oppressed, a propaganda tool, an immigrant trying to improve his new home, and a god among humans. But at the same time, it's much more than all that. It's an open conversation between generations. So we reinvent, criticize, idealize, and sometimes forget him. But he always comes back, because Superman doesn't belong to a specific era, country, or even a publisher. It's an idea that has already been permanently imprinted in our collective unconscious, but at the core, at the center of that idea, we all have of Superman. I think there's a big constant that we all think of Superman as someone extremely powerful, who does the impossible and fights to do what's right. To me, the character's greatest value is showing that, deep down, we all admire and want to see this. An extremely powerful person who uses that power not for his own good, but to benefit humanity. Because it's about someone who, beyond having heat vision or telescopic sight, has realized that human beings are all connected and we are all we have. So it makes perfect sense for us to be kind and decent to others. Superman is such a powerful idea that he has survived wars, censorship, editorial crises, and canon rewrites. Because we gave him that power. Because we, over 90 years of stories and adaptations, turned him into one of the most powerful ideas we've ever created. A concept more powerful than the atomic bomb. The belief that we can all live, aspire, and stand for truth, justice, and a better future. Geekers, I hope you enjoyed this video. I think this is one of the videos that took me the most work to make, so if you liked it, it would help me a lot if you share it and subscribe to the channel. And remember, if you want a detailed infographic with all the comics I talked about here, send me a message on Instagram and I'll gladly send it to you. That's it for today. I'm Go. Keep looking beyond the obvious.